All right, I think we're gonna get started. There's total capacity, people at the door. There's room over here inside.
Why does nobody want the chairs that are facing
There's
away?
chairs here, there's chairs over here. Don't be shy. All right, in case you don't know this, you are in XRP in Action, a live demo and expert Q&A. I'm Patrick Griffin, David Schwartz, Stefan Thomas. We have about an hour today. We'll walk you through, we'll do a quick round of introductions. Stefan is going to do a demo. We have a self-guided Q&A where I basically tee up some questions for these guys that will all be softballs, don't worry. And then we'll turn it over to you guys to ask questions for the technical experts. Maybe we'll do a quick round of intros, starting with Stefan.
Yeah, so my name is Stefan Thomas. I'm CTO at Ripple. Before Ripple, I was involved in Bitcoin for several years, and now I work on the vision and the technical direction for Ripple.
My name is David Schwartz. I'm the chief cryptographer at Ripple. I've been working on Ripple since 2011 on public ledger tech. Before that, I was working on cryptographic messaging systems and cloud storage for government and military applications.
And I am Patrick Griffin, I'm the head of business development. I don't know why I'm up here, but there's our CTO and our head of cryptography. But actually, I think we are keep me honest here, I think we're the 1, 2, and 3 first employees of Ripple. In that order, well, 2, 1, and 3. So we've been here for quite some time, and it's been a long journey. So why don't we first start off with the demo, and I think I'll tee it up. This is a demo that demonstrates our technology, starting with the Interledger protocol, moving payments in and out of XRP, and Stefan will do a better job of articulating what you're about to see.
Cool. All right, thanks, Patrick. So here we're gathered to have a quick roundtable on XRP, and I want to go through the demo pretty quickly so we can get to the actual discussion and Q&A, which I think is the meat of this session. Basically, what we're trying to do at Ripple is we're trying to make money move like information. This has been our mission since day one. That's never changed. And so we're building a number of different technologies that all integrate to make this vision a reality. And so when we think about how information actually moves, I think it's really this chart that captures it. So what's happened is that the cost of moving information has really declined over the last couple of decades, and very strongly so. And as a result, the volume of information that's been moving has exploded. And so very often, our customers will be talking to me about, oh, are you focused on corporate payments? Are you focused on consumer payments? And I think what you have to realize is that we're somewhere down here in that curve, and so when you say 2/3 of all payments are corporate payments, you're really talking about 2/3 of almost nothing. I think what we're focused on is this growth that you can create if you increase the efficiency of the system enough. And so the way that we're kind of approaching that is we want to streamline the way that liquidity works today. So today you have $27 trillion in float sitting around the world that is essentially there to facilitate real-time payments when the underlying systems are not real-time. So for instance, I swipe my credit card, somewhere there has to be actual credit or money available to pay that merchant if that's supposed to happen instantly, if the underlying money can't move in real time. And so that's been the case ever since we were using gold and fiat currencies in order to move money internationally. But with digital assets, there's actually the opportunity to improve upon that and actually move real assets in real time. So if you have something like XRP, you don't need to pre-fund float all around the world. You can actually just have this digital asset, and if you want to transfer value to somebody, want to transfer value internationally, you can just transfer that asset, and that moves instantly. Okay, so that's really the improvement. So with that, I want to give you sort of a use case example in a demo. This is something that already happens on blockchains today, where there are money services businesses that are using blockchain in order to move funds. So they might offer this as a service to small and medium businesses, where if I want to, let's say, pay somebody in a different country, I can go to one of these companies and they will move that money for me. So in this example, we're kind of pretending that we're a publisher, we have a reporter in the field, and we'd like to pay them. And so we don't really build apps, but we enable banks and other money services businesses to build apps on top of our platform. So this is kind of a mock-up that we've developed where you can imagine, this would be just built into the particular app of that company. And so I can basically pick any amount. So let's say I want to send $7. And what happens is you can see that amount updates. So what happens during that time is that we actually try to find the cheapest path from where the sender is to whichever provider that the recipient uses. And then once we found that cheapest path, we figure out what the exact cost is going to be. So we have that transparency up front. What is the cost of this payment? And this is all powered by the open source protocol Interledger. Now when I send this payment, it goes through right away. I don't have to wait for a ton of confirmations and so on. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening there in the background. So first, let me go to the slide. So first, we basically look at the topology of the network and then we try to find a path. So let's say I found a path through XRP. Once we've selected a path, we basically just send a quote request to figure out what the exact cost is going to be, and then we send the money through in 2 phases as per the Interledger protocol. And that's enabled on XRP using a feature called escrow that we just launched earlier this year. And so now XRP is fully Interledger enabled. So if we look at the kind of the cost calculation, this is kind of some fictional numbers, but it's correct in terms of the order of magnitude, right? So you have Bitcoin, you have Ethereum, you have XRP, you have Swift. And so our algorithm basically goes in and it tries to select the best option. And so people often ask me, like, why does Interledger help XRP? Or why are you guys working on Interledger as a completely neutral protocol when you're actually have this vested interest in XRP? And well, the reason is because XRP is right now by far the best digital asset, but it's not being used as much as Bitcoin, for instance. And so in order to close that gap, we want to get to a point where the selection of assets is kind of automated and you have algorithms that just pick the best one, in which case right now XRP would get picked all the time. So that's why we have such a vested interest in just enabling more efficient selection. All right. So yeah, as you can see, it's the lowest fee right now and it's the fastest transaction. Now, going a little bit further into the future, I was kind of talking about that huge explosion in volume, and I think where that comes from is completely new use cases that we don't necessarily think about today. So one example would be you have something like a publisher and a reader and a reporter, and the reader is actually browsing an article and they're not having to sign up and go through a paywall in order to do that. Their browser just pays on their behalf automatically. And then as a publisher, I can see the money sort of coming in real time as users are browsing my website. And so you're basically providing this sort of metered access to content. And that's just one example. I think there's lots of cases of APIs and other parts of the industry that could benefit from micropayments as a more granular way of transacting. So I don't have a ton of time to talk about that, but with that, I hope you got sort of a taste of both what XRP and Interledger looks like today, as well as what the future holds in terms of doing micropayments through payment channels and so on Interledger. So with that, I'll hand it over to Patrick to start the discussion.
Very cool. So maybe it's worth stepping back and also looking at our company strategy and having a conversation around what it means when we talk about an internet of value, which I think we're obviously a Silicon Valley company, and for most people that doesn't mean a whole lot. So maybe we can take a first stab at trying to explain what is an internet of value. And Stefan, I'll start with you. Actually, we'll only start Dave and give you a break.
Yeah. So what is the internet of value? And what are we working on? Well, the internet has brought connectivity to billions of people around the world. They have smartphones. They have easy access to the movement of information. But money is still siloed. It's still trapped in systems that don't talk to each other. Moving payments are expensive. They're slow. There's high friction. There's trillions of dollars that moves across borders, and that's moved mostly by financial institutions. And we need to move that money more efficiently. We need to know where it is. We need to improve that flow. I don't know if any of you have made international payments. I'm sure most of you have on traditional systems, and you know that it's very hard to know where that money is. It's very hard to know how much it's going to cost you ahead of time. The user experience is is not great. A significant fraction of those payments fail. It takes several days. It's almost easier to ship money than it is to use our existing payment system. So we want to provide an internet value where there's instant payment on demand without failure, where you know ahead of time how much money is going to deliver, you know what path it's going to take. And because that transaction is set up using modern internet protocols, you know ahead of time exactly what the requirements are at the destination so that you don't have a failure because you didn't have the right information in the payment in the beginning. Stephanie, want to elaborate?
Yeah, so whenever I think about the Internet of Value, I think the number one thing that happened with the Internet was that it kind of commoditized reach. So before the Internet, if you wanted to be an online services provider like AOL or CompuServe, the number one thing that you needed to have in order to be competitive is a lot of users. And if the main thing you're competing over is just having a lot of users, it's very hard to get into that market for obvious reasons, because you start out with 0 users. So how do you attract the first couple? But once you have something like the internet where all the different networks are actually tied together, suddenly the number of users you have is completely irrelevant, right? Because all of the networks are tied together, you can reach all the websites, you can email all the people on the internet. And so the competition has to be about something else. And what does it become about? It becomes about the efficiency of the system. And so this fundamental transition has not happened with money in. Like right now, the biggest consumer payment systems are things like Visa and MasterCard, and they're very much competing on, we're the biggest, we have the most merchants, we have the most customers, and so how are you going to compete with us, right? We don't even have to try to be efficient necessarily, right? Because we're only competing with each other. It's very hard to get into that market. And so what we're trying to do with Interledger is by creating an internetworking protocol, we're allowing you to go across multiple hops, across multiple steps through the financial system, and as a result, you can tie a lot of smaller providers, a lot of smaller banks together, and as a result, make the system much more competitive.
Yeah, I'll just add my 2 cents. I mean, when I talk about the Internet of Value with our customers, it's typically a conversation around cost. And opportunities. And for us, you know, while the analogy is it's overused, the internet, I think the Internet of Value, at least for me, is a function of bringing the marginal cost of payment processing down to as close to 0 as possible. Now, you can do that in one of 2 ways. Lower the cost of payment processing. Just for the sake of conversation, these 2 things are 50-50. Payment processing, the messaging going between institutions and and the cost of reconciling transactions as they go from one siloed network to another siloed network. Those are huge costs that the system currently bears just as a function of tracking down lost payments or fixing mistakes and broken transactions. Something like 12% of all international wires fail. That is an astonishing number if you come from Silicon Valley, where you're typically used to 5 nines of reliability. The financial system today isn't working even with 1 9 of reliability. The other side of the equation, so that's just it's a processing function. We are able to achieve better processing by starting at sort of the settlement layer. It's a little bit academic, but then ultimately what our customers are buying from us today is just a payment processing capability. The second stool, or leg of the stool, if you will, of this 2-legged stool for payment for this Internet of Value, is it's liquidity, and this liquidity cost is a huge component of the payments infrastructure today. So when you think about the cost that you pay when you wire money internationally, it's not just processing costs and fees. Banks and financial institutions and payment processors have to cover their cost of capital. They are laying out a massive amount of cash in different overseas accounts to make sure that when you send a payment to Japan, there's cash on hand in Japan to service your payment. The whole visual that you saw here with XRP, that's really where we see there being a large opportunity to bring the liquidity costs down. If you can fund your payment instantly, on demand, without pre-floating cash or opening up credit lines with your counterparties, you can really bring down a significant component of that cost. So those 2 things together, in my mind at least, that is what really comprises the Internet of Value. Is you tackle those 2 things, processing and liquidity, really starts to open up level the playing field. And on leveling the playing field, I maybe the question back to you, Stefan, is a little bit about the strategy. So as we go out and roll out these new APIs for bank-to-bank or financial institution processing, this narrative around using a digital asset to fund payments, certainly there's no reason why you couldn't insert Bitcoin in there or Ethereum or some other digital asset. Do you view this as maybe leveling the playing field for all digital assets and creating an opportunity for other digital assets to come in and basically compete for that exact use case?
Yeah, so we definitely look at it as a way to create more competition. I think that just looking at the market today, most of the digital assets out there are not really designed for enterprise use cases, right? They're coming from a background of direct-to-consumer use. They're kind of designed in a way that maybe isn't always necessarily totally in line with how regulators think about the financial system. And as a result, it's quite difficult for companies to use these assets. So I think maybe some of the people in the room are Bitcoin entrepreneurs, and so you may know some of these struggles, and you may know some of these difficulties of using an asset like Bitcoin. I think, me speaking as CTO, more from the technical side, there are definitely big differences between the different digital assets, and so if you look at things like settlement speed, on Ripple, you get below 4 seconds most of the time, 4 seconds on average. On Bitcoin, you have to wait 9 minutes between just to get one confirmation. There's things like finality. On Ripple, when you get one confirmation, you can 100% trust it. It cannot get reversed because the set of validators is known, so there can't be some validators you've never heard of suddenly coming up with a different answer. Whereas on Bitcoin, there can always be a longer chain that you just haven't heard of yet. So you have to wait for multiple confirmations to gain more confidence. Another difference is that Ripple is deterministic, and so Bitcoin is random. So what that means is that the actual delay between blocks on Ripple is pretty consistent. It's 4 seconds with standard deviation of 0.8 seconds. So it's almost always exactly 4 seconds. And so with Bitcoin, it's more variable, right? So you could have a block after a minute, you could have a block after half an hour. And so it's much harder for businesses to kind of rely on a system that has that high variability because it increases your risk as you're holding the asset. So just some examples of why we think that XRP is best suited for payments use cases. I think I'm actually giving a talk later today on going into a bit more depth on some of these differences.
And we're not afraid of a level playing field. As Stefan said, we think we can succeed on a level playing field. But also, you can get people to build a level playing field. It's very hard to get other people to stand behind something that has a built-in bias in favor of one company. Twitter doesn't mind the fact that the internet wasn't built for Twitter. Facebook doesn't mind. They like the fact that there's an open platform that everybody can support and use, and they're willing to compete on that level playing field. And if they lose on that level playing field, so be it. Somebody else will win, and the world will be a better place for it. We believe that we have the advantages today, and we believe that we can get the industry behind an open standard that facilitates these types of instantaneous payments.
So David, this is a question coming back to you. I mean, in this level playing field, obviously there are digital assets can compete on different characteristics. Obviously, I think the Bitcoin scalability challenges have been, I think, very famous recently. Could you comment a little bit on Bitcoin's recent woes, some of the things that have come up around resiliency, scalability, and maybe draw a contrast to XRP and how XRP is working?
Sure. I think the idea that you don't need governance, the idea that you can just have this decentralized system that magically governs itself doesn't really work. The internet is a decentralized system. It has governance. Bitcoin currently is experiencing a little bit of a governance failure due to a disalignment of incentives. Historically, the miners have had an incentive to keep the system working. Everybody needs the Bitcoin system to work, whether you hold, whether you are trying to do payments, whether you're mining. The system has to work or nobody has anything. And everybody's benefited from the value of Bitcoin going up. If you're a miner, you want the value to go up. If you hold Bitcoin, you want the value to go up. If you're using it for payments, having more liquidity and lower risk in holding Bitcoin is good for you. So everybody's incentives were aligned. They've started to become disaligned recently because miners have been getting a lot of revenue from transaction fees. Miners like high transaction fees. Users obviously would prefer to pay less for their payments. People who want to use Bitcoin as a payment platform want the frictionless payments, and they're not getting them because of the fees. So there's been a little bit of a governance breakdown due to that misalignment of incentives, and it's not clear how you resolve that. It's not really clear how the stakeholders can realign their incentives. I'm confident that Bitcoin will come through it, but I think it shows that governance is important. You should understand how a system is governed, whatever system it is, because there is going to have to be governance. It's not going to magically govern itself. Now, Ripple, the stakeholders are the validators, and the validators are sort of chosen by the other validators. So right now, Ripple is obviously very big in that space. We're the major stakeholder on the network. But the recent interest due to the price increase has begun diversifying the stakeholders, and so we hope to see in different jurisdictions, different companies, and those will be the people who will be the stakeholders, and they'll make the decision if there are going to be changes in the rules behind the network. We think that will work better, and I think if you once you accept that there has to be governance, you really want it to be the people who are using the network. You don't want the technology to force you into having other stakeholders whose interests may be averse to the people who just want to use the system to store value and make payments.
So, well, Stefan, I mean, do you have anything to add just in terms of the underlying design of the system, so how they're confirming transactions? I mean, I think when you go way, way, way back to at least our company's beginnings, it was billed as Bitcoin 2.0, and we felt like there was another way you could build a decentralized digital asset without mining. So maybe talk a little bit about the confirmation engine behind XRP and some of its advantages over other systems.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, I was fairly involved in the Bitcoin community back in 2010, 2011, and one of the features that I contributed to was pay-to-script hash. As a reviewer, I was one of the first people to re-implement Bitcoin, and I pointed out some flaws, and we ended up with a much better solution. And so through that experience, going through the cycle of a new feature on Bitcoin, even back then when the community was much smaller, I realized that it was actually very painful to do even a uncontroversial improvement to the system. And that was partly because people had a very strong sort of tendency to be conservative, which is a good thing for whenever you're modifying a live system. But there was also just no good process for introducing changes. We had to come up with a process ad hoc. We came up with this whole voting on mining power and so on. Now, from that experience, I remember going back to a wiki page on the Bitcoin wiki called the Hard Fork Wish List. And I kind of looked at it, and it was sort of the list of other things that we wanted to do. And a lot of them were, in my humble opinion, must-haves for any kind of mainstream or enterprise adoption. And so I was kind of putting numbers next to them. This would take 8 months, this would take 12 months, this would take 2 years. And it started to add up. And I'm not going to see this get to that point if we go at this rate. And then, Ripple approached me, and they had a lot of that hard fork wish list already implemented, but maybe more importantly, they had different idea around the governance structure. And I think there's sort of two key differences. The first key difference is there is an entity that's actually funding the development of the asset and of the technology behind the asset. And so I was looking at the Bitcoin Foundation website the other day, and they're currently their most recent blog post is to promote this lawsuit here in New York to try to strike down the bit license. And apparently the foundation feels that it's strategically important for Bitcoin to kind of fund this lawsuit. And then I looked at how many people had actually donated to the donation address that they were giving, and it was just over $1,000, so basically almost nothing. And I was thinking well, if XRP had any strategic issue like that, there would be millions of dollars immediately that just Ripple would put behind that issue. And so as a holder of the asset, that's really important for me to know that there is some entity that's actually defending it from a technical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from a business standpoint. That makes a big difference. And then the second big difference that I saw was how features and how generally the evolution of the technology is managed. So on Ripple, there's voting among the validators, which is not too dissimilar from the kind of mining voting that we're doing on Bitcoin. However, the validators on Ripple are largely chosen by the users, or they are chosen by the users, and so they're not chosen by sort of this algorithm or just by their virtue of being very efficient in mining. And so, as David pointed out earlier, the incentives are very different. On Ripple, the incentives are, I want the people who are appointing me to be validators to be happy with my validations, because otherwise, they will stop paying me. And so, there's a much more closely aligned incentive for the validators on Ripple to do what the actual users want to do.
And I would add that there are sort of vulnerabilities in both types of systems. Like with the miners, it would be a double spend. With the validators, they could simply stop validating and the network would halt. But one tremendous difference is that you know how to fix one, and it's not clear how you would fix the other. So if you had the miners that were being pressured, let's say, by a foreign government, or they were double spending, or for whatever reason they're holding transaction fees high. Let's say the block size issue got to the point where it was absolutely critical and there was no ability to come up with an agreement. It's not clear how you solve that. Do you change the mining algorithm? Like, that's the nuclear option. Nobody knows what you do. With a system like consensus, it is clear what you do. You can change the validators. The validators work at the pleasure of the users, the holders, the real stakeholders of the network. I think that is a fairly significant advantage once you realize how important governance is. And it's not just to handle a failure. As Stefan pointed out, there's going to be evolution of the system. Unless you think the systems are absolutely perfect today and are never, well, Bitcoin has already proven that they're not absolutely perfect today, and I certainly wouldn't try to claim that Ripple was perfect today. We have a wish list of features too, limited by engineering time, but we have to get people to agree to implement those features. And I think that's also an argument why you can't have one blockchain to rule them all. There are features that also have costs, and every feature has a cost, because if you have a public blockchain, everybody who uses that public blockchain, at a minimum, when there's a new feature, they have to do a security review to make sure that that feature doesn't create a vulnerability for them. So there's a fixed cost that's fairly high. There's a huge bug bounty on Bitcoin and on Ripple, right? Billions of dollars if you could steal money on the system. So the cost to implement a feature is high. So if there's a feature that somebody really wants and would be really useful for them, they're probably not going to get it. That's not enough to get any feature on these systems. So you're going to have a diversified system of multiple blockchains and multiple ledger systems of all kinds competing with each other for share. That's why I think Interledger is important, because Interledger will permit people who use different blockchains and different systems for good reasons to be able to make payments to each other quickly, seamlessly, and without the risk associated with the who pays first problem.
Okay, maybe, and just a last question before we turn it over to the audience. You mentioned Interledger. Stefan is the creator of Interledger, or at least the chief architect of it. When you walk around the conference today, you'll see a lot of companies that have blockchain offerings. So sort of going back to 2014, if you remember, the terminology and the marketing was all about, it's not about Bitcoin, it's about the blockchain. So now we have some perspective on that. What's your take on the fundamental premise of a decentralized distributed database without a digital asset, and what's the trade-offs in terms of functionality versus utility, and what's your opinion given the architecture of ILP?
Wow, that's a question I could easily spend hours on, so let me try to summarize. So, as you mentioned, my colleague Evan Schwartz and I, we came up with this protocol Interledger, and that came out of actually in a couple of different work streams, but one in particular I remember was I was trying to figure out how to make Ripple more scalable. And I was thinking about a particular kind of scalability, which is similar to what David just mentioned, which was scalability in terms of functionality, not just in terms of how many transactions can you do per second. Like, how do I serve very different use cases that have, mutually conflicting trade-offs? So as I was thinking about that problem, I was kind of saying, well, maybe you don't even have to keep that one set of global state. Maybe you can have state in different places, and a lot of that is honestly just rediscovering database knowledge that we've had since the 70s. Just looking at Jim Gray's papers and just, oh yeah, that works for blockchains. Oh, that works for blockchains too. And so we took those ideas and we combined them with ideas around from the internet background in terms of networking and this concept of internetworking and so on. And so when I look at these private blockchain type approaches, I think they are doing the first of those two steps, namely they're applying sort of modern database thinking or classical database thinking to blockchain, but I don't think they're really applying the internet thinking yet, because they're attempting to achieve interoperability just by homogeneity, which does not give you that diversity of use cases. And so if you want that, you have to think about what are the simple stateless protocols that can actually tie these different systems together without dictating how they work internally. So I can have my private blockchain that has all these like special features and it works in this way, and you can have your private blockchain that works in this other way, but we can still talk through a neutral protocol. And the way that we're thinking about Interledger, we're not married to Interledger being the thing. Like, it could like I'm completely happy if it's Lightning or if it's something else, but I think as an industry we need to agree on some kind of standard on that layer. And I think one of the reasons that we can is because unlike a blockchain, a standard is neutral. There's no asset that anyone's getting rich off of. There's a lot less to agree on. The list of decisions you have to make is a lot shorter. My colleague Evan, he makes a very good point about with Interledger only like 7-8 major decisions that you have to make in the architecture to really arrive at it. And so I think we have really good reasons for each one of them. And so we think that there will be a certain convergence on one standard protocol for, again, not just blockchains, but like any kind of ledger.
Just want to add that Interledger is completely neutral to how the ledger works internally. Any ledger that can support a very short list of very simple operations. Every banking ledger can perform those operations. Almost anything that tracks ownership of value of any kind is capable of confirming that value exists, putting that value on hold, transferring that value between two people. And those are the only primitives that Interledger builds on. It's just by the clever combination of those operations in a way that provides insurance that all of the stakeholders get out of the transaction the thing that they're supposed to get out and get back whatever they were going to put in if they don't get out what they were supposed to get out. It's astonishingly simple at the protocol level.
Okay. With that, I will turn it over to the room for questions and some Q&A. Any questions in the back?
I'm kind of new to this, and I just had some really basic questions. I read something recently where Ripple is now the second most funded or invested Bitcoin, as far as Ripple was second, and Ether was third. Can you tell me how you got to that position? It seemed like you're talking up about Bitcoin and how Ripple probably is more efficient, better. How about with Ether? Would you maybe do a comparison of that, or about that? Then I had a second question. Where do I get a Ripple t-shirt?
Got it. So the first question is just how did we get to this position we're in, and does that generally capture the essence of that question? And then Ripple t-shirts, I'm not sure. You'll have to
come work for us.
So I will attempt to answer that first question, and if you guys want to jump in, I think that is a function of one. Silicon Valley companies do one thing I think very well. They pick a lane and they go deep on it. For us, what we've been very, very focused on is a use case. As a company, we picked a long time ago to go deep on cross-border payments, and in particular wholesale cross-border payments. So that's financial institution to institution. It's at the enterprise level. And so when we look at digital assets today, we think that there is a very, very, very clear use case around the consolidation of capital to fund payments overseas, which is exactly what we just demonstrated, being able to transfer an asset from a server in one country to a server in another country and basically allow for payments companies to operate with much less capital deployed overseas. It's a quantifiable use case. Today there's $27.5 trillion in float in the banking system, just sitting idly waiting for payments to arrive. That's compounded when you go look at corporates and you look at payment service companies. So that is a very, 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 very big number. And I think that the recent traction that we've gotten has been an acknowledgement of the use case, how it fits into our overall product offering, some of the technical benefits of XRP itself. And then when you look around, I think that it's hard. You're hard pressed to find another digital asset with as clearly articulated a use case where the time horizon is now. I think that there's lots of really exciting things going on in IoT and device-to-device payments and sort of the future of some of the things that Ethereum people talk about, for example. But it still feels like it's still at the horizon. And I think this is being deployed today. There is a path to commercial production. And ultimately, I think that's part of the reason why we're getting some traction.
I think we also sort of crossed an important threshold. If an asset doesn't have value and it doesn't have liquidity, you can't really use it, even if it has the properties that are perfect for your use case, simply because you can't get enough of it without moving the market. And I think we crossed a threshold where there is enough value in XRP now that you can use it to make payments and you can use it as a store of value. And I think that also caused an uptick in interest, and so people started looking at, well, what is this? What are its properties? Who's behind it? What are the use cases? And I think people are seeing now the technical superiority of our design, the team that stands behind it, the amazing array of partners that we've managed to align with us. And I think they're starting to realize that we are going after these use cases aggressively and that they can actually just use XRP for many of the same things that they would traditionally use Bitcoin for.
I'll just echo the last part you said. I think it's really, our story was a very long-term story from the beginning. So I think the very beginning, a lot of people were looking at the different pieces and scratching their head going, how does that all fit together? And I think it's becoming more apparent of like, oh, you need the liquidity, you need the interoperability, you need the ledger. And so I think now it's starting to become like one coherent story in people's minds. And I think that's why there's a lot of excitement out there right now.
Did you have a question? I'm going to go over here. Yep.
Yeah, so can you talk about the dichotomy between a vehicle that's good for transactions and a vehicle that's good for a store of value? Because I think that a lot of people don't want to trade in cryptocurrencies for business simply because they may lose 30% of their value over a day.
Okay, so the question is the dichotomy between digital assets as a functional tool and as a store of value. David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think the biggest difference is what kind of features you're looking for, and you can very easily have an asset that has both, but they are somewhat conflicting and there's some trade-offs. Let me explain. So for an asset that you use as a store of value, I think your biggest criterion is going to be that it's deflationary, right? Like you don't want there to be, if you want to invest in gold, you don't want there to be a ton of gold in the ground. You don't want there to be an asteroid that's made of gold that just lands on Earth and suddenly everyone has gold's coming out of their ears. So you want something that's like scarce and will continue to be scarce, and also something that there's going to continue to be demand for in the future. So with something like gold, it's because it has a history of people investing in it. It's kind of going to continue to have a history of people investing in it, and there are some industrial uses that you can fall back on. So you can have reasonable confidence that a long time from now, gold will still be worth something. It might go up, it might go down, but it'll still be worth something. And on the side of an asset used for payment, a medium of exchange, the number one thing you care about is liquidity. So you want to be able to get into and out of it as cheaply as possible. You want it to be accepted as widely as possible. If you go to a merchant and they don't accept that medium of exchange, you've got to first convert it. It's a huge cost, and so it wouldn't be a good medium of exchange. So those are the features that you're looking for. Now, how are they aligned or in conflict? So I think if an asset is a widely used as a medium of exchange, that definitely creates some demand, and that helps make it store of value. However, that deflationary aspect is potentially something that that creates some trade-offs, because for something like an asset used as a medium of exchange, if you can actually use the newly issued assets as a way to incentivize liquidity, which is something that Ripple has started to do, you can increase the liquidity through that measure. And so you can use newly created units to increase the liquidity. And so in our case, we have enough of a buffer of XRP that we can keep doing that for decades, if not hundreds of years. But if there weren't, like if we didn't have a bunch of XRP, or if there was nobody doing that, it would probably be less useful as a medium of exchange, because there wouldn't be anything that's additionally increasing liquidity.
And I think that's another reason that XRP can succeed in a level playing field. There isn't really another asset where there's this company that has a war chest of that asset that they can use to increase its liquidity without having to increase a known fixed supply. So it increases the circulating supply, but presumably that's known and already figured into the value. So it's not like that's going to devalue it as much as a sort of variable increase in the supply of an asset.
Yeah, and there's at the tail end of your question, you asked, well, if there's volatility, how will there really be institutional adoption or real enterprise use? Part of that is just a function of productizing some of these flows that have been circling around this space for some time, not even just for XRP, but for sort of all digital assets. This idea that you can have a pool of liquidity in one currency trading against a digital asset in one country, and a pool of liquidity in another country trading against that same digital asset. And all the digital asset is doing is just shuttling between those different pools of liquidity. And in those pools of liquidity, you have market makers, hedge funds, speculators, traders that are providing the price discovery against the underlying digital asset. As a company, we are productizing that, and we're shipping products that simply show yen dollar, and somebody picks up yen dollar and they fund their yen payments overseas without any exposure to the underlying digital asset. So we just view that as a tool to almost transfer and shuttle the value from one pool of liquidity to another. And so we can effectively shield the user, the end user, the consumer of the quote, from the underlying volatility, and the volatility sits with the market makers, the risk takers. Question in the back.
I kind of had two questions. Are there any other blockchains adopting ILP as a cross-blockchain atomic transaction protocol? And then the second question is, Ethereum's adopting Raiden, Litecoin's going to be implementing Lightning Network, and then should Bitcoin activate SegWit, it'll have Lightning Network as well. Does the Ripple Consensus Ledger have an equivalent?
So the way that ILP is designed, it's designed to be extremely simple and, as was mentioned before, have as little demands on the underlying ledger as possible. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Litecoin are all already capable of everything that Interledger would need them to be able to do in order to work on those systems. So we've actually done pretty recently, I think last week, a transaction between Ethereum and Ripple, an Interledger transaction between Ethereum and Ripple on the respective live networks. And the only sort of gating factor, limiting factor is developer time. One of the next things on our roadmap is to make a Bitcoin plugin so we can do Bitcoin transactions as well. You asked about Ripple support Ripple Consensus Ledger has support for both escrow payments as well as payment channel payments. So they have slightly different trade-offs in terms of one is a little bit faster, but the other one is settling everything on Ledger, so it's a little bit more secure. So depending on the size of your payment, you might choose one or the other, but both of them support Interledger, right? So we can do Interledger payments using either one of them, and we've done that integration, so we have that support. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I mean, the other piece of this is we, at least as a company, we don't really care too much about what underlying technology is. I think Stefan alluded to this earlier. Really is the most adopted as sort of this protocol layer technology to move value from one ledger to another ledger. I mean, the first thing I would say there is this space is bigger than just blockchains. So it's not just about moving value from Bitcoin to Ethereum to XRP. I mean, it's about moving value from a bank ledger to a payment processor ledger to an exchange. Maybe there's a digital asset in the flows, maybe there isn't. And that's really, for us, the playing field, if you will. And so whatever allows us to sell the most software to connect into that, we're game. And we sort of are agnostic to that perspective. Now, obviously, we're developing ILP because we think that's the best tool and that has the most functionality and has the broadest components to support, a broadest set of components to support all those different types of ledgers. But that's it's part of our what is driving our adoption of our software. And then you click forward from our perspective. The question then is, well, the role of digital assets, how does that fit into that overall ecosystem? And we say, may the best man win. And we're ultimately trying to build out the digital asset that has the fastest, most reliable confirmation times and clearing capabilities. Is there another question? I'll go back to you. Yes.
All three of you give a different opinion about how high crypto should go.
Short answer is no. No, I mean, look, what I will say is, as an asset class in general, so digital assets are now north of $60 billion in market cap. Wow, that's a big number. But step back. This is a new asset class that will be here for as long as the internet is here. $60 billion is a rounding error in the long term of asset classes. So I take the personal view that I think that there's a long runway still ahead of us. I don't know what the timing is or what that's going to look like, but yeah, I mean, I think it's early days for this whole space.
And also for people who may work for other blockchain companies and companies in the space, the pie is pretty big by absolute numbers. You know, tens of billions of dollars is a lot. It's very, very small compared to the potential use cases and applications for the technology we're building. As an industry, we should not be fighting over who gets the biggest slice of this pie. We should all be working to make this pie many, many times bigger than it is. Some of the infighting that's occurring, you see it in Bitcoin governance, but you also see it across the different blockchains. It isn't helping. You're not going to make Bitcoin maximalist. You're not going to make Bitcoin bigger by saying bad things about small altcoins. I mean, if you feel like you have to warn people about things you think are scams, great. But I mean, growing the space is beneficial for everybody. The real world use cases, international payments, you know, many, many trillions of dollars. That's where we should be focusing.
Yeah, so, you know, we obviously can't give investment advice, but I think we can say some very general things like, you know, I've been investing in digital assets since 2010, and they're one of the riskiest, most volatile asset classes out there, so definitely don't invest money that you can't afford to completely lose, because you will, whether it's through, you know, losing your wallet or losing, you know, through a big collapse in the price of whatever you bought. So definitely beware. But as Patrick said, I think there's a lot of potential in the space, and so for long-term investors with very high risk tolerance, I think it's an okay asset class to have some exposure to.
I would just maybe add to that. It's before we go to this question. I mean, the part of that volatility equation and the risk equation is a function of use case. As these technologies ultimately start to realize their promise and their use case, there's commercial adoption and there's a real reason for people to be buying it. They're not just buying the promise. And I think that as quickly as we can get to the commercial adoption of these digital assets, not the promise and articulation of the promise of them, but the actual commercial rollout, then you'll start to see some of that risk come down. You'll see the volatility come down with it. And you know, we think that there is a race to getting the use cases achieved. And ultimately, you know, I would talking my own book. I would say with regard to XRP, XRP is the closest to doing that in a very large scale way. And we have a clear path to basically cross-selling a liquidity tool built on top of a digital asset across today's 75 bank network. And you know, I think that story will start to take traction. There's a question over here. Yep.
So what are you guys doing to make Ripple more accessible to end users and consumers?
Okay, so I'm going to jump in on that to start, and if you guys have thoughts. We take the view, and this is maybe goes back 5 years, where 5 years ago we started with sort of the business development challenge was an interesting one. We had this great technology, and then we had to try to figure out, like, okay, now how's it useful? And we basically took the throw spaghetti against the ceiling and see what sticks approach. We looked at loyalty points, we looked at merchant adoption, we looked at pretty much everything under the sun regarding value transfer, even sort of like syndicated loans and everything. And ultimately what we learned in the course of doing that is that there is infrastructure in place today that provides certain value to consumers, in particular on the consumer side. There's insurance, there's risk controls, there's authorizations, there's authentications, there's you know, ways in where you can store your value with a surety. So we stepped back and said this technology is really, you know, has where all the places are in place, all the pieces are in place to adopt today is institutional. And we felt like this technology, and we continue to feel this technology is still very early for retail adoption. That's just company view. I think that other people have different views. And so we're just focused on that layer. Now, what I will say is that I think that that's just a very, very, very long first step. But once you get sort of this technology embedded deep within the financial infrastructure, then I think you start to see a path to retail adoption. If banks are empowering their payments through digital assets, well, there's a clear path then for banks to provide accounts for digital assets with insurance behind them and so on and so forth. And then there's a path for, you know, consumer rails to start being really rolled out. I mean, I think even when you look at the merchant sort of companies like BitPay and so forth, some of those merchant stories, the merchant adoption has gone up, but the consumer adoption is not quite there. and there's a real reason why you would not use a volatile digital asset to pay your groceries or whatever the case may be. That will change eventually, but for today, it's just not our focus.
So when we first started out, we actually had a consumer-facing client, and we decided to sunset that. We had a credit card, we had all kinds of cool things. And that was us coming from a very much like a Bitcoin mindset. But if you think about it, how many people, even in Bitcoin, actual end users use Bitcoin? And I'm not talking about using Coinbase, I'm not talking about using BitPay, I'm not talking about using any kind of intermediary that's on my behalf on Bitcoin, but actually downloading the client, downloading a blockchain myself, and interacting with the network directly. If it wasn't for the Android wallet, I think that number would be very, very small. And even with that, it's a small number. And I think, my personal experience with Bitcoin, I lost one fairly large wallet. And so if I think about the user experience of using a digital asset directly, it's actually not that great of an experience because there's no one you can go to complain, there's no consumer protection built in. So it actually makes a lot more sense to me that there would be intermediaries that take off some of the rough edges for you, and then sure, there will be enthusiasts that use it directly, just like people run their own email server, but I think it's completely unrealistic to think that that will be the majority of people. Like the majority of people want a nice experience, and they're willing to pay for it, they're not worried about everyone's out to get them, and so we think that's a more believable model. And so once you presuppose that model, the things you start to be interested in is how do those systems integrate with the digital asset. And so that's what led us down the path of Interledger and so on. It's like, look at how these different exchanges work today. And if I want to move money from one exchange to the other, I have to withdraw it into Bitcoin, I have to get it into a Bitcoin wallet, and I have to deposit it into the other one, wait for confirmations each time. It's like, why isn't there a protocol that ties that all together? So that's exactly what we're trying to create with Interledger.
I think you can see an analogy in the early days of the internet where a lot of people were early adopters and they were using the earliest technology, and there wasn't broad adoption, and it was institutional adoption that drew people in. It was this idea that everybody could play on this platform that had there wasn't one company that controlled it. I think that was what brought it to the point where it made sense to launch consumer-facing products on that platform. The platforms that we have today in blockchain they're just not there yet. They just don't provide the basic features that ordinary people want. Customer support is very difficult to do because the underlying systems are so complex. And I think if you talk to any company that has a retail-facing blockchain product at this conference and you ask them how's their customer support been the past couple of weeks, I think you'll hear a uniform story. Many of you who are smiling and probably have your own personal issues, so you work for those types of companies. The technology is at the point where a very high level of sophistication is required to use it. It used to be you had to be a mechanic and to work on a car. You had a copying machine. If any of you remember back when your copying machine required regular service, we're in the day where it really isn't ready for retail adoption yet. I think trying to push that early is a dangerous strategy. People are starting to do that with XRP. We're hearing a lot more interest now that it has that volume and liquidity, but that's not our use case. If you want to do it, we're not going to stand in your way, but we don't think that really makes sense yet. We'll get there, though.
Okay, there's a question over here.
Yeah, you showed at the beginning an example of a publisher who was getting paid automatically and that you can enable this type of micropayments and transactions. So can you describe a little bit how do you handle this? How do you make it happen? What goes into the background? And perhaps the permissionless versus permission environment that you are going to rely upon.
Okay, so in that example, what we're envisioning is there are a couple of technologies that only exist in the form of prototypes today, have sort of reached maturity and are being used. And those technologies are, for one, the Interledger protocol itself. So the Interledger protocol, it creates an overlay network across different ledgers so you can make payments without having to know which ledger different people are on. And that creates that sort of universality, that reach that we need to have something like the internet. I don't have to care which provider you use, I don't have to care which blockchain you like, which digital asset's your favorite. I don't have to care. I can use whatever I like, you can use whatever you like, and Interledger makes sure that we can transact without caring about it or worrying about it.
So that's one technology. The next one is there has to be some sort of protocol through which the content producer is actually making the content available in exchange for payment. So we are very engaged with the W3C, have been for many years. Currently, we're members of the Web Payments Working Group, which has recently put out its first recommendation. It's currently being implemented by Safari and Chrome and Internet Explorer and Firefox. And as part of that effort, we're actually one of the two co-chairs. As part of that effort, we've been thinking about like what is the next step. Right now we're trying to make how can we make credit card payments better on the web. And I think one of the next steps will be how do we integrate Interledger payments into this. And then if you go even further, it's like how do you integrate sort of autonomous payments into the web. So how do you make it so that I can monetize my web application just by having traffic. I have traffic in my web application, there's a stream of money coming in. One of the points I want to make real quick just to show you some of the thinking that's going into this. If you have something like metered access, you get into a big psychological problem, which is people don't want to use metered access. If I worry about, every time I'm using this app, I'm paying this much per minute, I'm going to try to use as little as possible, log out as quickly as I can, and so on. And so a lot of people are raising that as a concern with our proposal for some micropayments on the web. But what I would say immediately to that is that the internet itself is also metered. So if I'm a small-time ISP, I will have metered access to the internet, and so I'll pay per gigabyte or terabyte or whatever traffic that I'm causing, or even just for the bandwidth itself. But as a user, I usually don't have that experience. And the reason for that is because of that exact psychological phenomenon where it's actually better for providers to subsidize some of their heavier users and overcharge some of their less active users and give everyone a flat rate, because then everyone's thinking, okay, I'm already paying for this flat rate, I'm going to use the service as much as I can. And then that creates that engagement and so on. And so with micropayments, you can do the same thing. So you can have a provider that charges you a flat rate, and then as you're browsing the web, it makes micropayments to any website that you're visiting. And as a result, is financing all these nice web apps, premium experiences, bypassing paywalls, disabling advertising. So you're getting a much better experience for that small monthly payment. And so we think that that's a very compelling story, and Interledger is an enabling technology for that, so it makes for a really good use case example. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
So we have time for one more question. Over here? Sorry. So I saw him first.
Got quicker hands. Two questions regarding the currency. In the first instance, do you need XRP to trade with USD to sort of get to the next level for the currency? Because in other words, right now you still have to usually get BTC and buy BTC and then get XRP. The second one is, what about in the US for trading for XRP? I know people who are interested in buying it, but institutional folks can't sort of go through all the machinations that you need to right now.
Okay, so the first question is, do we need a digital asset to trade US dollars to make a US dollar payment to another fiat? And the second is just how do you buy XRP and trade it in the US? The answer is no. To the first question, you don't need a digital asset. And so again, on that level playing field architecture, if JP Morgan has a strong liquidity in euro dollar, there's no reason for them to go through a digital asset. But if maybe a payment service company or a Bitcoin company like Wire is trying to get money into India, well, they might not have the capital to deploy and hold INR, and so leveraging a digital asset to get into that market is certainly attractive. So I think we should think about these things as liquidity tools. There's lots of different tools. A digital asset is one tool across multiple instances. In the U.S., you can trade XRP. You can wire at Bitstamp. Our friends at Bitstamp are on my left, and they trade U.S. dollars. You can also trade, I think, with Kraken. There's a whole number of exchanges where you can buy and sell XRP.
Yeah, I think a lot of them you can't get in New York.
That's possible. I'm not exactly sure. I think we have one more question over here. Yeah.
I was hoping that you guys could briefly discuss your decision to move those funds into escrow and maybe what the plan is for those funds, if any, and if you would use those for something like the lawsuit that you're referencing with the Bitcoin guys trying to sue the license.
So we're primarily VC funded, which is nice.
What was the question?
Our decision to put 54 billion XRP into escrow and what was behind that, and whether we would use that, for example, to fund the lawsuit. So we're primarily VC funded. That lets us use our XRP strategically. We don't so much have to use it like a bank account. We can more use it as a strategic tool. Certainly, if we were, if you could imagine, we're going to act in our own interest. If we were threatened and we had to draw on that, we certainly would to protect. That would protect, hopefully, the space as much as it would protect us. We're going to act in our own interest, but we don't have to draw off that like to pay salaries, or we can be strategic. We can use it to align incentives. Institutional buyers who may buy XRP with a lockup, they have an aligned incentive with us and other people who hold XRP because the future value of XRP is very important to them, and we're able to use it that way. It certainly is also a source of revenue. I'm not saying that's not the case, but I'm saying that that's not all of what's going on. I think also the fact a lot's been made about the fact that we're releasing 1 billion XRP a month. That doesn't mean that we're going to spend it. Obviously, we think the price is going. If we succeed, we believe that's going to put upward pressure on the price. And if we fail, well, we're going to fail no matter. If we fail, we fail. It is what it is. We're not trying to squeeze out as much money as possible. Today, we're trying to maximize long-term value. So I would expect a significant fraction of that XRP, particularly early, is just going to wind up going back into lockup in the roll. If you look historically, we've typically been selling between 100 million and 300 million XRP a month, roughly. With the increase in value and the increase in interest, it's hard to say, like, will it decrease because we have this increase in value? Will it increase because we're trying to incentivize more partners and get more done? I think either way, it's good. It's good for everyone.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a quick clarification on the lawsuit I mentioned. So that was an example of something that the Bitcoin community has sort of taken up. I'm not implying any particular position of Ripple, and it wouldn't be my place to announce that anyway. So we haven't announced any position on a particular lawsuit.
That was a hypothetical.
Yeah. Anyway, look, I think that everything we're talking about, this is a capital-intensive rollout. We're talking about re-engineering the entire financial system and the plumbing that underpins international payments. It's going to require a lot of capital, and I think everybody in the room understands that, and I think that that's part of the reason why you're seeing these increases in market cap across the board, and certainly this is a powerful asset for us to leverage to grow our network, grow our business, which is good for everybody, in that spirit of sort of building out a level playing field. So with that, I think we are wrapping up. Thank you everybody for your time and stopping by. We appreciate the